On the afternoon of Friday, February 7, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Loon was standing in her kitchen in the quiet town of Cunha, France, clearing off the table after lunch. Her husband, Claude, and two of her adult sons, Frank and Pascal, were sitting at the table, talking about what they needed to pack for the trip they were about to take. They were planning to drive to a family gathering near Paris, which was about 3.5 hours away, to celebrate Claude's sister-in-law's retirement. It was supposed to be a happy occasion, but Monique Loon was not going with them. She had told her family that she needed to stay home to take care of their 4 dogs, which was true, but it was not the only reason. The real reason Monique Loon wanted to stay behind was because there was a lot of tension between her and Claude's family. Monique and Claude had been married for almost 20 years, and when they first got together, they both had children from previous marriages. Monique had 3 adult sons, and Claude had 5 daughters. In the beginning, they tried their best to make the blended family work, but over the years, things became incredibly difficult. Claude's daughters were already teenagers or in their 20s when their father remarried, so they never really accepted Monique as a mother figure. Instead, their loyalties remained firmly with their biological mother, Claude's ex-wife, whose name was Beatrice. To make matters worse, back in 1993, a massive accusation tore the family completely apart. One of Claude's grandsons accused Monique's oldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexual abuse. This accusation was never officially reported to the police, so there was never a formal investigation, but it created a permanent divide. Claude's daughters and his ex-wife Beatrice fully believed the grandson, while Monique fiercely defended her son, Jean-Luc. Claude was caught right in the middle, and the conflict was so intense that the two sides of the family did not speak to each other for an entire year. Even though they eventually got back on speaking terms, the atmosphere was always incredibly tense and uncomfortable. Monique simply did not want to subject herself to that stress over the weekend, so she decided to stay home in Cunha. Around 3 in the afternoon, Claude, Frank, and Pascal loaded their suitcases into the car. Monique walked them to the front door, kissed them goodbye, and watched as they drove away down the quiet street. Once they were gone, she felt a sense of relief. She was looking forward to having a quiet, peaceful weekend alone with her dogs. A few hours later, at around 6:30 in the evening, Monique heard a knock at the front door. When she opened it, she was happy to see her son, Jean-Luc, standing on the porch holding his bicycle. He was on his way home from work and decided to stop by to check on his mother. As he walked inside and began taking off his coat, he mentioned that the neighbor across the street, a middle-aged man named Henri, had been staring at him from his window as he rode up. This made Monique feel a bit uneasy because Henri was known in the neighborhood for being a difficult and aggressive person. If anyone parked their car in front of Henri's house, he would vandalize the vehicle by slashing the tires or pouring oil over it. Over the years, Monique's family had gotten into several heated arguments with Henri about parking, and one of those arguments had even turned into a physical fight. Because Jean-Luc had ridden his bike instead of driving a car, Monique hoped Henri would just mind his own business and leave them alone. Monique led Jean-Luc into the kitchen and poured them each a glass of sparkling wine. They sat at the table, catching up and talking about how their week had gone. After they finished their drinks, Monique decided to give Jean-Luc a haircut, which was a regular routine for them. They spent about 45 minutes together, and around 7:05 in the evening, Jean-Luc put his coat back on, said goodbye to his mother, and walked out the front door. He hopped on his bike and began riding back to the apartment he shared with his wife. Now alone once more, Monique went about her evening routine. She ushered her 4 dogs behind a wooden baby gate at the base of the stairs, so they would stay on the first floor, and then she fed them. Afterward, she went back into the kitchen and began cooking dinner for herself. But just 25 minutes after Jean-Luc left, at around 7:30 in the evening, Monique heard another knock at the front door. She knew it was unlikely to be Jean-Luc returning so soon, and as she walked down the hallway to answer it, she hoped it was not their aggressive neighbor, Henri, looking for another argument. The next morning, the neighbor who lived right next door to Monique woke up feeling exhausted. She had barely slept because someone's dogs had been barking frantically all night long. She got out of bed, walked over to her bedroom window, and pulled open the blinds. As she looked down into Monique's front yard, she noticed something dark and motionless lying in the middle of the concrete walkway that led to the front door of the house next door. The neighbor pressed her face close to the glass and squinted, trying to make out what the object was. Suddenly, she realized she was looking at a human body lying face down on the pavement. Terrified, she ran to her phone and immediately called the police. A couple of hours later, Police Captain Ann P. pulled up to the scene in her patrol car. The entire area was already cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, and a medical examiner's van was parked by the curb. As Captain Ann P. stepped out of her vehicle, a patrol officer hurried over to brief her. He led her onto the property where the body of Monique Loon was lying. The officer explained that the neighbors had found her just like this earlier that morning. Based on the stiffening of the body, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had been killed sometime between 8 in the evening and midnight the night before. Captain Ann P. knelt down to examine the body of Monique Loon. It was immediately clear that she had suffered an incredibly violent attack. There was blood covering her face and clothes, and her upper body was covered in deep stab wounds. Ann P. also noticed very distinct defensive wounds on Monique's hands and forearms, which indicated that she had fought back desperately against her attacker. Ann P. stood up and asked the officer if any of the neighbors had heard anything suspicious during the night. The officer replied that no one had heard any shouting or fighting, but several neighbors did report that Monique's 4 dogs had been barking hysterically starting around 8 in the evening and continuing throughout the entire night. Captain Ann P. walked up the steps to the front door to check for any signs of a break-in. The door was closed, and there were no marks on the lock or frame to suggest someone had forced their way inside. However, right next to the door on the exterior wall, there was a clear, bloody handprint. When Ann P. turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, she was shocked by what she saw. The entire entryway and hallway were covered in blood. There were heavy spatters on the walls and thick pools of blood on the floor. Ann P. carefully stepped into the hallway, being mindful of where she placed her feet to avoid destroying any evidence. As she explored the rest of the house, she noticed that the blood was almost entirely concentrated in the entryway and the front hallway. This suggested that the attack had started and ended right there by the front door. But when Ann P. went back outside and looked at the walkway where Monique's body was found, she noticed a very strange detail. Despite the massive amount of blood inside the house and on Monique's body, there was absolutely no blood on the concrete walkway between the front door and the spot where she was lying. This detail was highly confusing. Monique Loon was a large, heavy woman, and because she had lost so much blood from her wounds, it seemed physically impossible for her to have run out of the house and collapsed in the yard without leaving a single drop of blood on the path. This led Ann P. to believe that the attack had occurred entirely inside, and then the killer had dragged Monique's heavy body out into the front yard after she was already dead. Because of Monique's size, dragging her would have required an immense amount of physical strength. Ann P. assumed that the killer must have been a large, powerful man, but she could not understand why a killer would take the risk of dragging a body outside into the open, where any neighbor could easily see them, unless they wanted the body to be found quickly. Furthermore, because there was no sign of forced entry, it was highly likely that Monique knew her killer and had opened the door for them. Around noon that day, Captain Ann P. decided she needed to start questioning the neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything unusual. She was about to walk next door to speak to one of Monique's neighbors when she saw a car pull up to the curb. 3 men climbed out, looking completely pale and deeply distressed. Having learned from the neighbors that Monique lived with her husband and sons, Ann P. immediately realized that these men must be Monique's family returning from their trip. To prevent them from walking into the active crime scene and seeing the horrific sight in the yard, Captain Ann P. hurried down the driveway to intercept them. As soon as she reached them, the 3 men crowded around her, desperately asking what was going on, where Monique was, and why there was police tape everywhere. Ann P. had to deliver the terrible news. She told them that unfortunately Monique Loon had been stabbed to death. The moment she said those words, all 3 men went completely silent, frozen in shock. Then one of Monique's sons broke down and began to cry. Ann P. explained that they could not go inside the house because the forensic team was still processing the scene. She gently led them over to the curb and the 4 of them sat down together. Ann P. could tell they were in complete shock. They seemed entirely unable to process the tragedy that had just occurred. But she knew it was critical to gather information as quickly as possible while the timeline was fresh. She pulled out her notepad and asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. Claude, the husband, explained that he, Frank, and Pascal had left the house at around 3 in the afternoon the previous day, leaving Monique home alone. They had driven to a family gathering near Paris, spent the night there, and had only just returned to town. They had no idea that anything was wrong until they saw the police cars outside their home. Ann P. then asked Claude to list the names of everyone in their family, including all of their adult children, Claude's ex-wife, and Monique's ex-husband. As Claude provided the names, he shook his head and told the captain that he could not imagine anyone in their family being capable of doing something so horrible. Ann P. nodded sympathetically, but in her mind she knew that in cases like this, family members are very often the primary suspects. She kept her thoughts to herself and asked if there was anyone outside of the family who might have had a reason to hurt Monique. Claude thought about it for a moment and said no, explaining that Monique lived a very quiet, ordinary, and uneventful life. But then, one of the sons spoke up. He told Captain Ann P. that there was actually one person who had been causing them trouble. He pointed across the street to the house directly opposite theirs and said, her neighbor Henri. A few minutes later, Captain Ann P. was walking across the street. She stepped onto Henri's porch and knocked loudly on the front door. After a few moments, the door opened and a middle-aged man answered. He looked out at the police cars and the yellow tape across the street with a look of intense curiosity. Ann P. introduced herself and told him that his neighbor, Monique Loon, had been murdered. When she said this, Henri did not look shocked or sad. Instead, a smile spread across his face. Immediately, alarm bells began ringing in Captain Ann P.'s head. Henri's reaction was incredibly suspicious, and his history of aggression and vandalism in the neighborhood made him an immediate person of interest. Ann P. asked him directly if she could come inside and look around his house. Henri did not seem surprised by the request at all. It was as if he had already anticipated that the police would want to search his home. He calmly stepped aside and said, "Sure, come on in." Captain Ann P. walked through the house, searching every room. She checked the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and the bedrooms upstairs. She was looking for any signs of a struggle, blood-stained clothing, or a weapon, but despite a very thorough search, she found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. There were no traces of blood or anything else suspicious. She returned to the living room where Henri was waiting and asked him where he had been the previous evening. Henri answered casually that he and his wife had been home together the entire night. Ann P. knew that an alibi provided by a spouse is often unreliable, but she made a mental note to interview Henri's wife later to see if her story matched his. Next, Ann P. asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything unusual across the street the night before. Henri shook his head, but then he added that around 7 in the evening, he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. This detail immediately caught Ann P.'s attention. She knew from her conversation with Claude that Monique had a third adult son named Jean-Luc, who had not gone to the retirement party in Paris. If Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was almost certainly the last person to see Monique alive before the estimated time of her death. And if Jean-Luc was the last person there, he was also a highly likely suspect. The following morning, Captain Ann P. led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building located in a sketchy part of town. She reached the door of Jean-Luc's apartment and knocked. A moment later, a young man opened the door. Once she confirmed his identity as Jean-Luc, 2 police officers escorted him away to the station to be questioned. Meanwhile, Ann P. and her forensics team entered the apartment to conduct a thorough search. As Ann P. was walking through the living room, one of the forensic officers called her over. He was standing near a wall, shining his flashlight at a specific spot. When Ann P. got closer, she saw what he was highlighting, several tiny, dark red droplets on the wall that appeared to be blood. Ann P. pulled out her own flashlight and began carefully searching the surrounding area. Near the staircase and the entryway, she found a few more tiny red droplets on the floor. She kept scanning and noticed more droplets on the doorknob of a small closet. She turned the knob, opened the closet door, and shined her light inside. Resting in the closet was a bicycle. When Ann P. directed her flashlight at the underside of the bike, her eyes widened. There were dozens of reddish-brown splatters covering the lower frame and the undersides of the wheels. It looked exactly as if someone had ridden the bicycle directly through a large puddle of blood. An hour later, Captain Ann P. walked into an interrogation room at the police station. Jean-Luc was sitting at the table with his head buried in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and his face was filled with fear and confusion. Ann P. sat down across from him and got straight to the point. She asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the evening of February 7th. Jean-Luc explained that he had simply stopped by after work, which was something he did regularly. He said he had only stayed for about half an hour to visit and get a haircut, and then he rode his bicycle back home. Ann P. asked him if he had gone straight to his apartment after leaving his mother's house. Jean-Luc shook his head and said no. He explained that his wife's brother, Christophe Gracier, lived in the exact same apartment building as they did, on the floor directly below them. Jean-Luc said that before going up to his own apartment, he had stopped by Christophe's place to chat for a few minutes. Afterward, he went up to his apartment and spent the rest of the night with his wife. To Captain Ann P., this story felt far too convenient. She had just found what appeared to be fresh blood droplets scattered on the walls of his apartment and all over the underside of his bicycle. She believed Jean-Luc was lying, and she decided to push him harder to see if she could break his story. She looked him in the eye and told him point blank that they had found blood inside his living room and on his bicycle, and that the forensic lab was currently analyzing it. The moment Jean-Luc heard this, his face turned bright red. He began to stammer and stutter, nervously explaining that the blood in his apartment must have come from a neighbor who had accidentally cut himself while visiting a few days prior. Ann P. listened calmly, and then she pointed out the blood on his bicycle. Jean-Luc opened his mouth to speak, but he hesitated, completely unable to come up with any logical explanation for why his bike would be covered in blood splatters. At this point, Ann P. felt confident that she was close to getting a confession. She told Jean-Luc to stop talking and instructed him to roll up his sleeves. She knew that Monique Loon had fought back fiercely against her killer, as evidenced by the deep defensive wounds on her arms. If Jean-Luc was the killer, he would almost certainly have scratches, scrapes, or bruises on his hands and arms from the struggle. Jean-Luc slowly rolled up his sleeves and extended his arms. Anne P. examined his hands, wrists, and forearms very carefully, but to her utter surprise, she did not see a single scratch, red mark, or bruise. His skin was completely clear. Frustrated but still highly suspicious, Anne P. left the interrogation room and walked back to her office. Even though Jean-Luc had no physical signs of a struggle, his nervous behavior and the blood found in his apartment made it impossible to rule him out. However, she knew she had to avoid getting tunnel vision. If the blood in Jean-Luc's apartment turned out to be a coincidence, she needed to make sure she was looking at other potential suspects. She sat at her desk, opened the case file, and began reviewing the notes from the interviews her team had conducted with the rest of Monique's family and neighbors. She read through the statements of Monique's other sons, who had mentioned the intense hostility between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. The police had already interviewed all 5 stepdaughters and their husbands. While some of the stepdaughters admitted they still harbored resentment toward Monique because of the past family feud, every single one of them, along with their husbands, had solid alibis for the night of the murder. Anne P. then looked at Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice Matisse. Several family members had mentioned that Beatrice absolutely despised Monique. However, when officers tracked Beatrice down, she did not seem like a viable suspect. She told the officers that she and Monique simply stayed out of each other's way and had not even seen each other in over a month. Furthermore, Beatrice was incredibly small and frail. She was 58 years old, stood barely 4 feet 9 inches tall, and appeared very physically weak. It seemed absolutely impossible that a tiny, frail woman like Beatrice could have overpowered Monique, who was much larger and stronger, stabbed her dozens of times, and then dragged her heavy body out into the front yard. Because of this, Beatrice Matisse was essentially ruled out as a suspect. Just as Captain Anne P. was closing the file, there was a knock on her office door. An officer was standing there, and he informed her that there were 2 people in the lobby who urgently wanted to speak with her regarding the Monique Loon investigation. Anne P. told him to send them in. A moment later, a middle-aged man and woman walked into her office. Both of them looked incredibly nervous. They sat down across from her desk, and the man explained that he had information that could be critical to the case. Anne P. grabbed her notepad and told them to go ahead. The man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Grassier, the brother-in-law of Jean-Luc, who lived in the same apartment building. He said that earlier that day he had received a phone call from Christophe's number. When he answered, there was no one speaking directly into the phone. Instead, all he could hear was a muffled background conversation between 2 women. At first, the coworker assumed it was just an accidental pocket dial, perhaps made by one of Christophe's children playing with the phone. However, because the conversation sounded strange, the man put his phone on speaker so his wife could hear it too. As they listened closely, they managed to overhear a highly disturbing snippet of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were actively talking about needing to create an alibi, and they specifically mentioned the name Jean-Luc. The man told Captain Anne P. that one of the women had said, "It is not Jean-Luc's fault, he is depressed." Then the other woman mentioned that there was a pair of pants that urgently needed to be washed. Annie P. was stunned. This tip seemed to confirm all of her suspicions about Jean-Luc. It sounded like family members were actively conspiring to cover up his involvement in the murder and destroy evidence, specifically his blood-stained clothing. She quickly took down the couple's contact information, thanked them for coming in, and escorted them out of her office. As soon as they were gone, she grabbed her car keys and headed straight to Christophe's apartment building. By this time, Christophe had already been brought in for questioning, and he had completely denied knowing anything about the murder or the strange phone call made from his phone. But Anne P. hoped that a search of his home would provide the physical evidence they needed. She entered Christophe's apartment and searched through the rooms until she reached the utility area where the washing machine was located. She put on a pair of latex gloves and reached inside the washing machine. At the bottom of the drum, she found a pair of pants that were still damp, indicating they had been washed very recently. She pulled them out and held them up to the light. On the fabric, she could clearly see a dark, brownish stain that had not fully come out in the wash. She also noticed that the pants were far too small to belong to Christophe, who was a tall, heavily built man. However, they looked like they would perfectly fit someone of Jean-Luc's smaller, slighter build. At this point, it seemed like the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. 2 days after Monique Loon's body was discovered, on February 10th, Captain Anne P. was sitting in her office when her phone rang. It was a technician from the forensic crime lab with the results of the tests on the evidence they had collected. Anne P. sat up, ready to hear the confirmation that would allow her to officially charge Jean-Luc with his mother's murder. But the technician's update was not what she expected at all. He told her that the reddish-brown splatters found on the underside of Jean-Luc's bicycle were indeed blood, but it was not human blood. it was animal blood. He went on to explain that the tiny droplets of blood found on the walls and the closet doorknob in Jean-Luc's apartment were human blood, but they did not match Monique's DNA. Finally, the technician revealed that the dark stain on the damp pants recovered from the washing machine was not blood at all. It was just industrial grease. Anne P. felt a wave of intense frustration. She had been completely convinced that Jean-Luc was the killer, but now all of the physical evidence against him had completely evaporated. Furthermore, they had no way of verifying the strange phone call reported by Christophe's coworker. It was entirely possible that the coworker and his wife had misheard or misinterpreted a completely innocent conversation between family members. She thanked the technician for the update and was about to hang up when he told her to wait because there was one more important piece of news. He explained that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had managed to recover foreign DNA from under her fingernails. It appeared to be skin cells from her attacker, scratched off during the violent struggle. The technician said it would take a few weeks to fully analyze and sequence the DNA, but once it was complete, they would have a perfect profile to test against any potential suspects. This news gave Anne P. a renewed sense of hope. After hanging up, she sat down and began making a list of everyone they would need to collect DNA samples from. Jean-Luc and Christophe were still at the top of the list despite the lab results. She also added the neighbor, Henri, whose aggressive behavior and strange reaction to the murder still made him highly suspicious. She had interviewed Henri's wife, who confirmed his alibi, but she knew spouses often lied to protect one another. But beyond those three men, Anne P.'s list was completely empty. The rest of Monique's family had solid alibis, and none of the other neighbors had any motive or history of conflict with Monique. Monique Lune had lived an incredibly quiet, normal life, and she did not have any enemies. Anne P. realized that there was a major piece of the puzzle still missing. She decided to use the time while waiting for the DNA results to meticulously review every piece of evidence and re-interview everyone, hoping to find whatever she had missed. Over the next few weeks, Anne P. pored over the files, spoke to the family members again, and knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood. But despite her immense efforts, she found nothing new. Then, in early March, she received another call from the crime lab. The technician informed her that the analysis of the DNA recovered from under Monique's fingernails was complete. He told her that even before comparing it to any of their specific suspects, the results had already narrowed down the search significantly. The moment the technician explained what they had found, Anne P. realized exactly what the missing piece of information was. The DNA under Monique's fingernails did not belong to a man. It belonged to a woman. Based on this groundbreaking DNA evidence and an eventual full confession, the police were finally able to reconstruct exactly what had happened to Monique Lune on the night of February 7, 2003. At around 7:30 in the evening, a killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked. When Monique opened the door, she did not invite the person inside. Instead, she stood in the entryway, crossed her arms, and stared. The killer began to speak, but what was supposed to be a conversation quickly turned into a heated argument. Both women began hurling insults back and forth. Finally, Monique decided she had had enough. She yelled one last, deeply insulting comment at the visitor and slammed the heavy door right in her face. This final insult pushed the killer completely over the edge. Consumed by a sudden, blinding rage, the woman stormed back to her car parked nearby. She reached under the seat and grabbed a large knife that she kept there for self-defense. She walked back up to the front porch and knocked on the door again. The moment Monique opened the door to see what she wanted, the killer shoved her way inside the hallway. She raised the knife and began stabbing Monique repeatedly. Despite the sudden and horrific attack, Monique Lune fought back with immense strength. She managed to grab her attacker and knock her to the floor, pinning her down. But the killer managed to free her arm and continued to stab Monique over and over again. As the violent struggle continued, the 4 dogs behind the baby gate began barking frantically, and Monique screamed out in pain and terror. Eventually, the sheer number of stab wounds took their toll, and Monique's grip weakened. The killer scrambled to her feet, ran out of the house, and fled in her car. As the killer drove away, she looked in her rearview mirror and saw Monique Lune stumble out of the front door, covered in blood. She took a few steps down the walkway before collapsing face down on the concrete yard. The killer did not stop. She drove to a nearby supermarket parking lot, threw the bloody knife into a trash can, and went home, where she burned her blood-soaked clothing in her stove. She believed she had gotten away with it, confident that she was the very last person the police would ever suspect of such a brutal crime. The killer was 58-year-old Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 4'9" tall, frail ex-wife. In her confession to the police, Beatrice explained that she had gone to Monique's house that night under the pretense of finally ending their long family feud. But when Monique insulted Beatrice's daughters, Beatrice snapped. She had been ruled out early in the investigation because the police assumed only a strong man could have overpowered Monique and moved her body into the yard. But the physical evidence showed that Monique's body had never been moved. Even after being stabbed over 50 times, Monique's adrenaline was so high that she had managed to chase Beatrice out of the house before collapsing in the yard and passing away. Because she fought back so fiercely, she had scratched Beatrice, trapping her skin cells and DNA under her fingernails. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on March 29, 2003. She confessed immediately, though she later tried to take the confession back. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison on the evening of Friday, October 29, 2004. 52-year-old Fred Javelin walked into Temple Beth Ahaba in Richmond, Virginia for the Friday night service. He watched with a deep sense of pride as his 3 children, Jocelyn, Paxton, and Callie, walked ahead of him down the aisle to find their usual seats. The autumn night was cool and cloudy, and the trees surrounding the historic synagogue were bright with red and gold leaves. Temple Beth Ahaba was the oldest Jewish house of worship in the city, and just being there always made Fred feel a sense of peace and comfort. Every time he walked past the plaque outside the temple and read the words urging justice, mercy, and humility, he reminded himself that those qualities had helped him survive the most painful years of his life, and they would guide his family toward a brighter future. As Fred settled into his seat, he took a moment to reflect on how important his community and his faith were to him. He had learned the power of gratitude the hard way, through a long and incredibly bitter divorce from his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree. Fred was a well-known and highly respected college professor who had been an early pioneer in the field of organizational communication. When his marriage began to fail back in 1999, he had truly believed that he and Piper could work through their differences civilly. But that was before he discovered that she was having an affair with their oldest daughter's doctor. While that affair was the breaking point that led him to file for divorce in 2001, it was only the final betrayal in a long series of erratic and disturbing events. In the years leading up to the divorce, Piper's mental health had declined significantly. She was taking medication for depression and attention deficit disorder, but her moods remained highly unstable. The situation escalated dramatically when Piper began calling the police, falsely accusing Fred of physically abusing her and claiming that he was trying to drug her. They tried marriage counseling, and Piper moved out of the house multiple times to stay with a friend, but her behavior became increasingly unreliable. Despite having a law degree, she struggled to hold down a job, and she began neglecting the children. The final straw came when police officers arrived at the University of Richmond, where Fred had a tenured teaching position, and arrested him in front of his colleagues and students. Piper had gone to the magistrate's office and sworn out a completely false domestic violence warrant against him. Fred and Piper had met back in 1981 at the University of Texas in Austin, when Fred was a 29-year-old professor and Piper was a 21-year-old law student. On paper, they had nothing in common. Fred was from a working-class Jewish family in New York, average-looking, thin, and highly analytical. He valued routine and rational thinking. Piper was from an old Texas family, exceptionally beautiful, artistic, and a free spirit who loved animals. Despite their differences, they married in 1983 and had 3 children over the next decade. When Fred got a job offer from the University of Richmond, which came with a $30,000 raise, they moved to Virginia, hoping for a fresh start. But the move only made things worse. Piper failed the Virginia bar exam, grew deeply homesick for her family in Texas, and slid into severe depression. She racked up over $52,000 in credit card debt, and their marriage completely fell apart. After his humiliating arrest at the university, Fred hired an excellent attorney and presented evidence of Piper's erratic and neglectful behavior to a judge. The court quickly realized that Piper's claims of abuse were entirely fabricated, and Fred was granted temporary custody of their children. The divorce was finalized in 2002. Because Fred had provided all the financial support and Piper had failed to show up for the final hearings, the judge awarded Fred nearly all of their property and assets, as well as full legal and physical custody of the children. Furthermore, because of Piper's high earning potential as an attorney, the court ordered her to pay Fred $890 a month in child support. Piper was devastated by the ruling and tried multiple times to declare bankruptcy to avoid her financial obligations, but her filings were dismissed. She eventually moved back to Houston, Texas, where she could practice law, but Piper and her older sister Tina were determined to get revenge. Tina, who was a nurse practitioner, wrote a highly malicious 43-page psychological profile of Fred, filled with false accusations of physical and sexual abuse, drug addiction, and severe mental illness. Piper emailed this document to Fred's colleagues, university administrators, the parents at his children's schools, and their scout leaders, hoping to destroy his reputation. This campaign of harassment made Fred incredibly anxious. He took steps to protect his family, including installing a high-tech home security system and changing his will so that in the event of his death, custody of his children and control of his assets would go to his brother, Michael, who lived in Northern Virginia. He had also learned from a neighbor that Piper had once confessed to sneaking Prozac into his coffee when they were still married. But now, 2 years after the divorce, it seemed like life was finally returning to normal. Fred was thriving as a single father. The children were doing great in school, and Fred had recently started dating a wonderful woman named Charlene. Piper had also built a stable life in Houston, working in land title research and dating again. Although she was often late with her child support payments, Fred remained flexible, even allowing her to take the children on a long camping trip in Virginia a few weeks earlier. After the Friday night service, Fred drove his kids back to their beautiful brick home on Hearthglow Lane in the affluent KK Kingsley subdivision. Halloween was just 2 days away, and the yard was filled with leaf bags shaped like orange pumpkins. Fred put the kids to bed around 10 in the evening, called Charlene to chat, and then went to sleep looking forward to a weekend of pumpkin festivals and trick-or-treating. The next morning, Saturday, October 30th, at exactly 6:37, Fred's next-door neighbors, Bob and Doreen McCardle, were startled awake by the sound of 3 loud gunshots. Bob McCardle, a former Marine, ran to the window, pulled back the curtain, and saw a dark figure running across his lawn before disappearing into the shadows of the neighboring properties. Bob immediately called 911. 3 police officers arrived quickly and searched the dark yards with flashlights, but they found nothing suspicious and left. 25 minutes later, Doreen McCardle called 911 again, her voice shaking with terror. She and her husband had gone outside to walk their dog, and as they passed Fred's driveway, they discovered his body lying on the pavement next to his car, surrounded by blood-soaked leaves. A massive police response descended on Hearthglow Lane. A SWAT team cleared the house and safely rescued the 3 children who had been asleep inside. Homicide Detective Kobe Kelly arrived on the scene and began his investigation. There were no signs of robbery, and the house was untouched. It appeared that someone who knew Fred's morning routine had been lying in wait for him. Every morning, Fred walked down the driveway to retrieve the newspaper. This morning, as he walked around his black Ford Explorer, the killer stepped out from behind the garage and fired 3 shots. 2 bullets struck Fred. One went through his arm, but the other, a hollow-point bullet, entered his back and traveled upward, tearing through his internal organs and causing massive, fatal bleeding. Detective Kelly immediately placed Fred's ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, at the top of his suspect list. Even though the children said their mother had called them the night before from Galveston, Texas, Kelly ordered his team to check flight manifests for any flights from Texas to Virginia over the past few days. By that afternoon, investigators made a shocking discovery. A passenger named Roundtree had booked a flight out of Norfolk, Virginia, heading back to Houston, Texas, just a few hours after the murder. But the first name on the ticket was not Piper. It was her sister, Tina Roundtree. Detective Kelly obtained a photo of Tina, who was a blonde woman, quite different in appearance from the dark-haired Piper. Kelly contacted the Houston police and asked them to intercept the passenger when the flight landed at Hobby Airport, but due to a miscommunication, the passenger managed to slip away unnoticed. When Detective Kelly called Piper that evening, she claimed she had been in Houston the entire time and had multiple people who could verify her whereabouts, including a lawyer colleague and a patron at a local bar who saw her on Friday night. Her sister, Tina, also had a strong alibi. The sisters pointed fingers at other potential suspects, including Fred's brother, Michael, and his new girlfriend, Charlene, suggesting that Fred had many enemies. Meanwhile, the sisters refused to participate in further interviews and checked into a luxury hotel in Houston, while Piper immediately filed for custody of the children. But Detective Kelly was determined to uncover the truth. He flew to Houston and went to Hobby Airport to interview Kathy Molly, the Southwest Airlines ticketing agent, who had helped the passenger traveling under Tina's name. When Kelly showed Kathy Molly photos of both Tina and Piper, Kathy immediately pointed to the photo of Piper Roundtree. She remembered her clearly because the woman was wearing a very obvious blonde wig and was checking a firearm as luggage. With this positive identification, investigators began pulling cell phone records. They discovered that the phone call Piper had made to her son Paxton on Friday night, during which she claimed to be in Texas looking at a raccoon, had actually pinged off a cell phone tower located right in Richmond, Virginia, just miles from Fred's house. Furthermore, investigators discovered that the plane tickets had been purchased using a credit card belonging to Piper's boyfriend, Jerry Walters, which he had reported missing. Piper had also used the card to buy a blonde wig, and her Jeep was found parked at the Houston airport during the days surrounding the murder. On November 8, 2004, Piper Roundtree was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Fred Javelin. During her trial in February 2005, Piper took the stand and tried to imply that her sister Tina was the real killer, claiming she had no idea how her phone, Jeep, and boyfriend's credit card had been used in the crime. The jury did not believe her. After less than an hour of deliberation, they found her guilty. Piper Roundtree was sentenced to life in prison. Her sister, Tina, later pleaded guilty to attempted tampering of evidence and was fined $300. Fred's brother, Michael, was granted full custody of the 3 children. On the morning of July 23, 2006, 74-year-old artist Maurice Agus was pacing back and forth in Riverside Park in Chester-le Street, England, feeling incredibly frustrated. Today was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his 40-year career as an artist. He had designed a massive interactive art installation called Dreamspace, which was roughly half the size of a soccer field. Inside the structure was a sprawling maze of colorful, interconnected rooms made of thin plastic sheets. The exhibit was designed to be fully immersive, with soft, colorful lighting and calming, ambient music playing to create a serene, tranquil experience for the visitors. Because of its massive size, setting up Dreamspace in the public park had been highly challenging. On the morning of the opening, Maurice realized that several sections of the structure were not aligned correctly. He and his staff spent several hours scrambling to make adjustments and fix the issues, but the work took much longer than expected. Outside the entrance, a long line of visitors who had already purchased tickets was beginning to form. People were checking their watches, looking annoyed and impatient. Maurice grew increasingly anxious. This was his final major project before retirement, and he was terrified that if they did not open the doors soon, the crowd would lose interest, walk away, and his masterpiece would be a failure. In his haste to open the exhibit, Maurice decided that the adjustments they had made were good enough. He told his staff to stop working on the remaining safety checks and immediately opened the doors to begin letting the public inside. A few hours later, at around 3:15 in the afternoon, 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings was walking through Riverside Park with her 14-year-old grandson. It was a beautiful, warm summer day, and they were enjoying their time together. As they walked, her grandson pointed across the field toward a massive, colorful, glowing structure. They could hear beautiful music drifting from the open entrance, and a large crowd of excited people was gathered around it. Intrigued by the unusual sight, Elizabeth and her grandson decided to purchase tickets and go inside. The moment they stepped through the entrance, Elizabeth was amazed. The interior was dimly lit, and the thin plastic walls glowed with vibrant colors that shifted as they moved from room to room. The peaceful, dreamy music filled the air, and despite the warmth inside the plastic structure, the atmosphere felt incredibly relaxing. They spent about 10 minutes slowly wandering through the colorful maze, completely mesmerized by the experience. Eventually, they entered a room filled with a beautiful blue light. As they stood there, admiring the way the blue light mixed with the warm yellow light from the adjacent room, they suddenly heard a deafening, sharp snapping sound. Immediately, Elizabeth felt incredibly dizzy, and the colorful walls around her began to tilt violently. She stumbled, trying to keep her balance, but she suddenly felt a strange, floating sensation. When she looked down, she realized with horror that her feet were no longer touching the ground. Outside the structure, Maurice Agus was chatting with visitors in the park, feeling immensely proud of the successful opening. Suddenly, the loud snapping sound echoed across the field, followed immediately by terrified screams. Maurice spun around and looked toward his installation. He was horrified to see large, dark shapes falling from the sky and crashing violently onto the grass. After a moment of stunned confusion, he realized that those shapes were human beings. In his desperate rush to open the exhibit and keep the crowd from leaving, Maurice had ordered his staff to stop securing the structure before they had finished tying down all the vital safety lines. While the front of the massive inflatable plastic installation was anchored to the ground, the back of the structure was completely unsecured. Dreamspace was essentially a giant inflatable plastic balloon. As a sudden, strong gust of wind swept through the park, it caught the unsecured back of the exhibit. The massive force of the wind ripped the remaining anchor ropes out of the ground, which was the loud snapping sound everyone heard, and lifted the entire structure 30 feet into the air. The dozens of people inside, including Elizabeth Collings and her grandson, were trapped inside the collapsing, twisting plastic as it soared high above the park. As the wind violently shook the installation, the plastic tore open, and people were thrown out of the structure, falling onto the hard ground below. The disaster resulted in 27 serious injuries and 2 tragic deaths, including 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings. Maurice Agus was devastated by the catastrophe caused by his negligence. He was convicted of health and safety violations and fined, and he never created another piece of art for the rest of his life. He passed away 3 years later, in 2009. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!